Well, tonight we're going to continue thinking together about the story of what's been happening to Joseph in the book of Genesis. We're going to make our way to Genesis chapter 40. Genesis chapter 40. And where Joseph is at in prison, it would be very easy for us, very easy for me, to think that what can God do with someone in an inaccessible place? And yet, as the story unfolds, we're going to find out that prison was just the place that God wanted Joseph to be. And I think that's a hard pill for us to swallow. That sometimes God allows, maybe God directs and ordains that we end up in places we don't want to be, so that His glory can shine through all the brighter. Genesis chapter 40 will begin in verse 1. We're going to be doing a fair bit of reading tonight, and we will look at these chunks of Scripture. Genesis chapter 40, verse 1. Sometime after this is after Joseph had been thrown into prison, the cupbearer of the king and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them, and they continued for some time in his custody. One night, they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked them, who were there with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast?" And they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Joseph, though he is in prison, is still being used by God. A lesson that we can take from this: God will use us no matter what station we find ourselves in life. If you are a child who goes to school, if you're a teenager that goes to school, a student that goes to college, a young professional, a middle-aged professional, an older professional, a person who's recently retired, a person who has been retired so long that they feel like they've been retired longer than they worked, God will use you in that station. It may look a little bit different from age to age and place to place. Obviously, God will use Joseph a little bit differently in prison than when He uses him in other places. But God will and can and does find a use for us wherever we are at. But we have to let Him. And we have to be willing. Sometimes I hear people say, "Well, I don't bring a lot to the table," or I don't have a lot of gifts, or my situation dictates that I don't have a lot of freedom, I don't have a lot of ability, I don't have a lot of what freedom and ability? Where did Joseph? What could he have done? And yet he found a way to be exceedingly useful to the plans of God. God will use us no matter where we are. And in fact, sometimes, this is opinion here, sometimes I think the moments we think ourselves least useful are maybe in fact the times where we are most useful to our God. Because it's in those moments when our weakness is evident and we realize we can do nothing of ourselves, it is then that God is at work most mightily in us. And so God is at work here in the life of Joseph. Another thing that I want us to pick up on is, remember where Joseph is at? He is in prison. And yet, what we find Joseph doing in the situation that he is in, even though he is risen to the top of being a prisoner, whatever that really entails, you're still in prison, can't be that great. He takes a great interest in both of these individuals, not just taking care of their physical needs or whatever other needs that he has been given authority over, but a care in their spiritual and emotional needs as well, as he comes in and he recognizes that these two individuals are distressed. There is something, I think that's kind of an interesting statement. These people have been thrown in prison by Pharaoh. Obviously, they're distressed when they got there. At least I would be distressed. Pharaoh can do what he wants with you, whatever he wants. That would be distressing in and of itself. And here, yet they've had these dreams that's even more distressing to them. And Joseph picks up on that. He is paying attention to these individuals. Even though, by what Joseph can tell, his interest in them is going to pay no personal benefit to himself. Point number 2. We ought to take interest in all people, not just those whom we believe can advance our cause or our agenda, or do something for me. I'll be nice to you if you're nice to me. I'll do a favor for you if you do a favor for me. Joseph doesn't say any of that, nor is that implied in this. He will ask a favor at the end, but it's a pretty reasonable request. Remember me before Pharaoh when you get out. But he doesn't require it. He simply asks it. Joseph doesn't think about how these people might advance his interest. He is simply concerned with taking care of their needs and easing their path just a little bit, trying to ease their distress. Brothers and sisters, ought this not be the way that we look at other people? Our world teaches us to look at people, to look at things, to look at materials as objects to be used, and when they have ceased to be of utility to us, we jettison them and throw them away. How many of us have a phone that's 2 years or older? Some of you probably might. How many? Anybody's phone lasts 4? I got one. No, not 4. Just 3. Yeah, we use. Oh, Doug's got one that's. Does he still have a flip phone? It's called a feature phone, by the way. It's all right. That's okay. It's okay to keep things, right? But we live in a world where it's the cult of the new. What have you done for me lately, right? You ever watched or listened to Monday morning football quarterbacks? Man, it's great. You know, what did you do for me yesterday? You might have won 100 games for me in the past, but yesterday you blew it. Let's find a new guy. It's brutal. What have you done for me lately? We can be tempted to use people like that as well. What have you done for me lately? What do you bring into the friendship? What do you bring into the marriage? What are you bringing into this partnership, this business relationship? What have you done? We're all too quick to treat people as disposable items when we ought to treat them as people whom God has created, who are in distress, and who need our help. Or at least need us to take a vested interest in them. And Joseph does that. As Joseph learns that they have been given dreams, and they almost add this, but we've been given dreams, but what good is it? Because here we are in the pit of the world, essentially. Who is going to tell us what these dreams mean? They're almost just resigned to hopelessness. And Joseph makes an extremely astute point. And he's going to make it again in another situation, in a little bit different words, but it's the same point when he gets before Pharaoh. Spoiler alert, by the way, if you don't know the story. But Joseph says, do not interpretations belong to God? Point number 3. God alone is the source of all right and good interpretation. This goes for dream, at least in the case of these individuals and upcoming with Pharaoh. This goes for viewing the world through this particular lens, viewing our God as the mover and the shaker and the doer and the provider and the be-all, in-all, and through-all of human history. We interpret the world that we see through the lens of the Word our God has given to us in Scripture. We see things differently than the world sees them. Why? Because we have a different vantage point. A vantage point that does not belong to us, although we use it. It is the vantage point of the Almighty. That's how we see. Or rather, that's how we ought to see the world, ourselves, and others. That's how we ought to interpret the things that happen to us through that particular lens. That it is God's interpretation and His alone. And so, Joseph listens to the dreams. We continue on into verse 9. And so the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream there was a vine before me. And on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, a blossom set forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes, pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. And 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. You shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, as formerly you were his cupbearer. Only remember, when it is well with you, please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh. And so get me out of the house, for I was indeed stolen out of the land of Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should have put me into the pit. And so here is what I mentioned, that Joseph does make a request that he be remembered. That hardly seems to be seeking some kind of advancement. He's simply seeking some thanks. Just remember me, and that I have told you these things. Verse 16, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uttermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days, and 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree. The birds will eat the flesh from your body. One dream, good outcome. One, not so good. Some thought has been given as to why these 2 individuals were put into prison. A thought that I find perhaps most favorable is that Pharaoh's food testing has gone and ended up with a dead individual, and he's put these people in prison, and he's trying to determine which one of them is the responsible party. There are other theories, but that's the one that I like the most. That seems most reasonable to me. It could certainly be incorrect, but the time has come. Pharaoh is going to figure it out, and he's going to make his decision about what to do. And you're not going to be able to argue against Pharaoh. He gets to choose. He is the king. And so Joseph delivers this news. I'm not an expert, but I would imagine that Joseph enjoyed telling the cupbearer's dream interpretation a little bit more. Hey, you're going to get out of here, man. Just 3 days. Just hang on. You're going to be all right. You're gonna make it back. You're gonna get your position back. By the way, cupbearer, very, very prestigious, certainly at least in by Babylonian times, position in the kingdom. A very trustworthy position. Something that takes great personal risk frequently, having to taste some of the food and what the king takes in. But anyway, Joseph, I bet he liked telling that interpretation. I doubt he much enjoyed the next one with the baker, having to tell him, this is what's going to happen to you. Much as I don't think Samuel enjoyed giving a terrible bit of news to Eli. Your sons are going to die, and so are you, thus declares the Lord. Shorthand there. As we think about Joseph giving these interpretations, God has given to Joseph the gift and the ability to interpret them. Number 4, God has given us just the right gifts at just the right time. In prison, who can interpret dreams? God, through Joseph. God allows for Joseph to be able to interpret these dreams in just the right time. Who could have imagined that people from Pharaoh's court are going to end up in this prison, that there's going to be someone there who can interpret their dreams and plant that seed for Pharaoh in years to come? You can't miss it, that God is involved in moving and shaping the pieces that are going on around. And in Joseph's life, I imagine when this was all going on, it might have been hard to see it, but it was happening. Another thing that we can look at, mentioned in a little bit briefness, is that some of God's messages we won't want to hear. Sometimes God's messages are hard to take. Certainly the baker didn't want to hear that interpretation. He wanted something else. He heard a good interpretation from the cupbearer. Maybe that's going to be for, I want a good interpretation too. I'll risk it now. But not all messages are ones that we will want to hear. Look at Jesus. Jesus delivered some hard messages. Jesus delivered some things to people that were difficult for them to accept. To the rich young ruler, go and sell your possessions. He couldn't do it. No, he wouldn't do it by the grace of God. He chose to go his own way. Matthew chapter 23, when Jesus unloads on the religious leaders, and he's trying to convince them of their evil and their sin, and they don't want to hear it. It's a hard message to take. You can look at Jeremiah telling the king, just open up the city, give up the siege, don't drag it out. I promise you, if you just surrender, it'll be better. Wasn't listened to. Things could have been a lot easier, but he didn't want to hear it. We live in a world where people don't want to hear the message of God. Sometimes they close their ears to it and they say, whatever mental gymnastics I have to do to not hear it, I am going to do that. Don't close your ears to God's message, even if it be a difficult one. So Joseph delivers this news, and this is what transpires. On the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by So, you ever been in Joseph's position? You do something really great for some. You take care of them, you help them, you bring them along, you encourage them, and when the time comes, and all you need from them is for them to say, "Hey, Pharaoh, this guy in prison, he interpreted my dream. Maybe you should go get him. Maybe you should." And he forgets. How do you forget something like that? I wonder if God's hand was yet again involved in this. Because God still needed Joseph there at just the right time, at just the right moment. But for Joseph, 2 years, 2 more years in prison. You and I, we can step back and we will keep reading, and it'll be over in 2 years is going to be over in 2 seconds, right? But not for Joseph. Joseph is going to endure more patience, more silence, and more waiting. And he doesn't even have a choice in it. So that he can be right where God needs him to be. Spent two more years in prison. For doing the right thing, by the way, which we talked about last. Can you put yourselves in Joseph's shoes for just a few moments? We know that it's only 2 years for Joseph, right? But for all that Joseph knows, he's been completely forgotten. He doesn't know that these dreams of Pharaoh are coming. Never mind even the thought that he would be brought up to do something about those dreams. For all he knows, he is still stuck in prison for the rest of his life, waiting. Can you put yourselves in Joseph's spot? And how difficult, how depressing, how challenging that would be. And yet, when the moment comes, we're going to read about that in a few moments, Joseph is ready to strike, so as it is said, when the iron is hot. When the moment comes, his patience will pay off, and he is ready to act, and he acts decisively. Brothers and sisters, there's a lesson there for us as well. Sometimes we're going to wait a long time for things to pan out. Sometimes we're gonna work on a person who's not a Christian, and we're gonna work and we're gonna work and we're gonna work, and then sometimes we're gonna just step back and we're gonna wait and we're gonna say we're gonna let the seed play itself out. I've planted, I've watered, I've done what I can, and sometimes that sprouts, and then sometimes we wait to see some more, and we're ready for when the iron is hot. Genesis chapter 41. Verse 9, Pharaoh has had a terrible set of dreams, and no one can interpret them. And so what happens when all potential resources of the kingdom, the best of the best, the wisest of the wise, the people that have been guiding Pharaoh perhaps from birth till now, when all answers lead nowhere, where do you turn? Turn to a slave in prison. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants, he put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream, as he interpreted it to us. So it came about, I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. When they had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret. Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not in me, but God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came out of the Nile and fed on the reeds of the grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor, very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. The thin, ugly cows ate up the 7 plump cows. When they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still ugly as at the beginning. And then I awoke. I saw also in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good, 7 ears withered, thin, and blinded by the east wind sprouted after them, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me." Over the course of this chapter, as Pharaoh relates the story a number of times, and as we get it from his dream itself, the number 7 is repeated 28 times. The word famine, 12. If you look earlier in the chapter, you can see the ineptitude of Pharaoh's magicians. And at the forefront of all of that is happening, as Joseph prepares to give to Pharaoh an interpretation of the dream, we see yet again this idea that at all times, at all places, to all people, it is only by the grace and the power of God that we receive or do or know anything. It is God's work. Joseph is a part of that work. God uses him, but it is God's work. What impresses me the most is as Joseph is brought in, this is his moment, folks. If he messes this up, he's got nothing left. This is his chance. And he's brought in before Pharaoh. He's probably given, he's presentable, whatever that took, to come in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, "I've heard that you can do this. I've heard that you can do this." And Joseph makes it clear, it's not me. It's God. Joseph, this is your chance. Capture the spotlight. It's not me. It's God. You turn over to the book of Acts, chapter 14. Paul and Barnabas will heal a lame man, and they'll be giving credit to Paul and Barnabas. This town, and Paul and Barnabas plead with these people. It's not us. We're not the gods come down. We're men. We're human beings. It is God who does the work. It is by the grace of God that we can give you healing and, more importantly, the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Joseph takes a similar approach in different words, but in reminding Pharaoh, it is not within me. I am a human being. It is God who gives. Joseph waited a long time for this moment in dire situation, and when the moment came for him to take just a little glory, won't do it. It is God. It is God's. We could learn from that kind of attitude. It is God's, not mine. I think if we added to that, we might be able to say, I am just thankful to be a servant in the household of God, that he finds work enough for me to do. And if we have that kind of attitude, God will find us plenty of work to do in his kingdom for his purposes and his will. And we can do it by the grace of God to the best of our abilities. And so Joseph, having listened to the dream, having made sure that Pharaoh knows this is going to be an answer from God, the story concludes. Verse 25, Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good years are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty years blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of famine, not all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine. And the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that it is a thing fixed by God, and God will bring it about shortly. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers to the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. Let them gather all the food of these years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities. Let them keep it. The food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land, so that the land may not perish through the famine. And so what happens is, in the course of this conversation, Pharaoh makes Joseph second in the land. Joseph's got the best rise, best comeback story, perhaps of all time. He goes from being in the jailhouse to being number 2 in the land. What a remarkable story. And Joseph, what does he do to earn it? It's the working of God. Joseph is faithful. Joseph does what is right. He does what is good. He helps others. But he doesn't somehow earn this. He doesn't somehow deserve it. God gives it to him at the right time, at the right place, to work out God's own good will. So as Joseph recounts and tells Pharaoh what these dreams mean, he tells Pharaoh, the message is pretty clear. And it's like a lot of biblical interpretation stories. A lot of time you wonder what it means, and then you hear the interpretation and you go, oh, that really makes a lot of sense. I get that. I had trouble with it before, but now that there's been an explanation, I understand a little bit. How often do we miss the clear messages from God about what we should be doing? You ever put your phone down for 5 minutes? You turn it off at night. Does anyone brave enough to do that? You do. All right. We got a couple of brave people, right? I don't. You might miss the call. In fact, it seems like when I turn my phone off, that's when I get a whole bunch of messages and a whole bunch of calls, and I get all those messages. I feel like I have to call people like, hey, I'm sorry I turned off my phone. What'd you do that for? Oh, I didn't want to be disturbed. How often do we sometimes miss the clear messages that God has for us in His Word? Be faithful unto death. Well, what if that hurts? What if it costs me? What if I have to be ostracized? What if I be faithful unto death? It's not complicated. We tend to try to overcomplicate things sometimes. This morning when we talked about Peter, Lord, how many times shall I forgive someone? What's the number count? What's the max? I'll go up to that, but then you forgive. How often do we miss the clear messages of God? Let us not miss them. Finally, this. Again, we must wait patiently for the doors to open. But when they do, we must be ready to go in faithfully to do the will of God right away. The Apostle Paul, in speaking on evangelism, the book of Colossians, chapter 4, speaks about waiting patiently, seasoning your language with salt, and he asks them to pray that a door might be opened. And when that door is opened, pray that I might proclaim the gospel clearly as I ought to. An apostle was asking for help and prayer to proclaim the gospel at the right place, at the right moment, when God opened the door. If Paul needed prayers for that, I think we need prayers for that too. When God opens the door, we had better be ready to go through with everything we have. And Joseph does that. When the door is open just a crack, he is ready to say, I can fill this role for you. I can be your man, Pharaoh. And he does. And he does a tremendous job. And as we find out, and as we look forward, Joseph, by the grace of God, saves Egypt, saves his family, and depending on how severe the famine was around the world, saves the world. All because God knew where Joseph needed to be. And Joseph was willing, or at least endured, being there as a slave, as a prisoner, and then in the household of Pharaoh. May God so use and orchestrate his plan today in our lives. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, set him over the land of Egypt. Is Joseph hinting? Or had God provided him the dreams of this reality many years ago? And when the moment was right, God's plan came together. May God's plans come together in our lives. May we let him, and may we give him the glory. May God bless us with the hearing of his word. May God help us to look to Joseph as an example of faith and as a man who was at the right place at the right time where God had placed him. Maybe tonight something that I have spoken, or maybe there's something else going on in your life that is giving you cause where you need prayers and encouragement from the body of Christ. Then the invitation is to come and receive those prayers. And maybe this evening you are not a Christian. You need to become one. You need to become right with God. Do not wait. Another moment is not promised to you, nor I. Take advantage of the one you have now. Have your sins washed away in baptism. Be born again as a child of God. If you have a need, the invitation is to come. Won't you come as together we stand and as together we sing.